I'm Scott Sagan, the co-director here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. I wanted to welcome you all to this seminar on what's next in the Iran-Israel nuclear conflict. I'm going to introduce the three speakers very briefly, and then they'll speak in the order in which they are introduced. We'll take some questions from the audience here live, but we also have a Zoom audience, and we'll be collecting those, and I'll be reading some of the audience ones from the Zoom group. Our first speaker will be Sig Hecker. Sig Hecker was at the Los Alamos National Laboratory for 34 years, including 12 years as director. And then he came here to the Center for International Security and Cooperation for 17 years, including 6 years as the co-director. He's now a part-time professor of practice at Texas A&M and at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies at Monterey. He's the author with Elliot Serbin of Hinge Points, an insider look at North Korea's nuclear program, editor of Doomed to Cooperate, How American and Russian Scientists Joined Forces to Avert Some of the Greatest Post-Cold War Nuclear Dangers. Our second speaker is Abbas Milani, the Hamid and Christina Moghadam, Director of Iranian Studies at Stanford and professor by courtesy in the Stanford Global Studies Division. He's also one of the founding co-directors of the Iran Democracy Project here. He taught at Tehran University's Faculty of Law and Political Science until 1986. He has written so many books that we will not have a seminar if I read the books, but his biography of The Last Shah is the one that I most strongly recommend to you. Our third speaker is Ori Rabinowitz, visiting scholar here at CSAC and a tenured senior lecturer at International Relations Department at Hebrew University. She's the author of Bargaining on Nuclear Tests, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. And just last month, she finished a new book manuscript on the evolution of Israeli and US counter-nuclear proliferation policy. So I'll have each of you speak no longer than 15 minutes, then we'll open it up for Q&A. Sig, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Scott. It is like homecoming time. I've been gone a few years now, but those 17 years were beautiful years, especially the interactions with the students and my colleagues here. And I've talked here often about Russia, about China, about North Korea, and a little bit about Iran. And so today we'll do Iran and Israel. So what we thought where we would start is, actually, I will start with the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, sort of the nuclear deal with Iran in 2015, because Abbas will go back and he knows much more about the history of those places. And so he'll give you, I'll start with Iran. Pretty much my own analysis of it, which I shared in this one. It was that, look, Iran has been putting the pieces in place to be able to build the bomb, for several decades. And by 2015, when I used to give the lectures, I said, they're probably a month or so away from being able to build a bomb. And so as the Obama administration was negotiating, then of course the Joint Comprehensive Plan is much bigger than that. It has all the 5 nuclear powers and EU and so forth. As they were negotiating, and then when the deal was made, I said, hey, at this point, this seems to be about the best thing to do. And that is, it walks Iran farther away from actually assembling those pieces. And in several areas, it actually walked them back. And the one I was particularly interested in, since I'm a plutonium guy from Los Alamos, is they essentially gave up the plutonium reactor. And I wouldn't give up plutonium if I'm going to build a bomb. So I thought, that's pretty good. So they walked away. But then, as happens, of course, in the U.S., we change administrations. And just as we changed administration and President Trump came in, Prime Minister Netanyahu made this big pitch about how close Iran is to the bomb. And my view was, yes, of course, we know that, administration before you knew all of that. However, what was actually new was that Prime Minister Netanyahu laid out the essence of what they learned from the Israelis' raid of the Iranian nuclear archives and the 100,000 pieces of information they actually brought back and analyzed to some extent. And when I saw Prime Minister Netanyahu giving all of that, I said, okay, what else is new? I mean, he's been saying this for years. But then a number of my colleagues actually got to see much of the archives by going to Israel. And when I saw their report, I said, oops, my view was maybe Iran was a month or so away from the bomb. What I didn't appreciate, they were really a month or so away from a nuclear arsenal. So this Project Ahmad showed how from the 90s on, particularly the late 1990s, that Iran had put the pieces in place to be able to have a missile deliverable nuclear warhead of around 10 kilotons or so, pretty close, let's say, to Hiroshima, and to build 10 of those. And so this was late 1990s. So I said, well, this is really serious. Well, during the deal, the Iranians actually did walk away. And, it's a very complicated thing. I'll be happy to answer questions. They walked away from the uranium enrichment, gave up a lot of things. Again, as I said, let the plutonium reactor go. We, the Americans, said, they were under strict international inspections and so forth. And that was actually true. They were inspected and all of that. But what Project Ahmad showed, as I told you, is they were looking to get a nuclear arsenal. And then not only that, but at least to me, the person who does the best job of following the Iran nuclear program, and at least his technical stuff, is David Albright at the Institute of Science and International Security. And what David, very clearly showed is whereas the international inspectors were able to get into many of the facilities where the Iranians had agreed to step back, they were never allowed to go into the facilities that were quite weapons related from everything that was understood. And so my concern then also was raised. However, President Trump then walked away from the deal. And I thought, that's really too bad because at least we've got them contained to some extent. And my thought was, maybe one needs to rework and say, hey, let's come to grips with this. But he walked away. Okay, when he walked away without really a good plan B, is the Iranians then started putting all the pieces back in place. And that was going on, at least from 2020 or so onward. But then what happened, we had a political game changer, and that is when Hamas went in on October 7th, 2 years ago. And then that, to me, at least from my perspective, again, worrying mostly about the nuclear world, that changed a lot of things, because one of the things that came out of that in October of 2024, Israel attacked a number of the facilities and places in Iran. And I was actually asked about that. What do you think about Israel attacking nuclear facilities? I said, I don't think it's a good idea to attack nuclear facilities. And of course, it depends what you actually do and where you do it. And then as we watched what was done, what was really interesting is there didn't seem to be all that much damage done. They didn't do any of the real nuclear places themselves. But what the Israelis did was incredibly clever. They essentially wiped out the air defense systems around the nuclear facilities. And then as things developed, into this year and June, and Israel had decided, as they put all of these pieces together, situation in Iran changing, and we'll hear much more about that, and particularly from a standpoint of the sort of the Iranian proxies, having been significantly weakened in terms of what they could do. Israelis having checked out the defensive capabilities of those sites, and then they went in and bombed the nuclear facilities. These are the nuclear fuel cycle facilities. And in fact, interestingly, very importantly, they did not bomb the Bushehr nuclear power reactor. So they were actually not after Israel's nuclear power program. They were after the enrichment sites and all the things that are necessary to get to the point of enrichment. So that's more or less of what we heard. But then, as David Albright also nicely showed, it turns out the Israelis bombed much more than that. And many of those sites that we had known for years, there must be some weapons activities, a place called Parchin and so forth. Israelis bombed all of those places also. And then in addition, as I'm sure you heard, the Israeli penetration, the intel penetration in Iran was just remarkable. With the pager situation of those things blowing up, and then a lot of the commanders being blown up, and the nuclear scientists. By the way, I must confess, I don't like nuclear scientists being assassinated. I've been in all of those places around the world, and I don't like that idea a lot. But anyway, it showed just how deeply the Israelis had penetrated. And then, somehow the Israelis convinced President Trump to actually join that. And as you know, he took the big bunker busting bombs and then also dropped those, especially in this Fordo facility, which was deeply buried. And the Iranians specifically put it deeply buried, to keep it away. And so then the question was all about, okay, so what actually happened? What was destroyed? And of course, President Trump, in his usual way, said it's gone. It's totally obliterated. Well, it wasn't totally gone. But so my analysis, and that essentially will lead me to sort of the point where one could think about real next steps, is if you look at the nuclear weapons program itself, it greatly damaged the weapons program. In other words, to be able to actually put together a nuclear arsenal. It did not wipe out the ability to build a few bombs. Particularly for those of you who followed it closely, there was this issue that the Iranians had decided not only to do the low enriched uranium, but they took it up to 60% uranium-235, the bomb grade. And there were 400 kilograms of this. And nobody knew for sure what happened to those 400 kilograms. Well, you don't just destroy that stuff easily. And in my opinion, I can't believe the Iranians didn't have that squirreled away someplace in some fashion that they could take it back. And if they could, then what you could do with that 400 kilograms is you take it and you up enrich it to 90 degree, which is good bomb grade, highly enriched uranium. And with that, they could make a few bombs. Or actually, they don't even have to do that, because everything over 20% is called highly enriched uranium. What does that mean? It means you could theoretically build a bomb even out of 20% or 21%. It would just take too much to make it really worthwhile. But at 60%, it turns out you can make something. You can make a few bombs. So the Iranians then were left with the capability to make a few bombs that would be useful, let's say, in a terrorist-style attack, but pretty useless from a standpoint of deterrence. So that's not a nuclear arsenal. So that's my assessment of what happened to the military part of the program. But what essentially wasn't touched at all is, the Iranians said they were doing this enrichment for nuclear power, because for nuclear reactors, you only have to enrich it to 3 to 5% of 235. But it turns out the civilian nuclear power program essentially was wiped out, because you need lots of centrifuges, you need lots of chemical facilities to put all of this together. And so the Iranians have made this point for all these years: we're not willing to give up our God-given right of having civilian, nuclear power and enrichment with that. Well, my view then was, you don't have the enrichment program anymore. You'd have to rebuild it. So that's where they are now. They sort of have the ability to build a few terrorist-like bombs, and they really don't have a civilian enrichment program. They'd have to rebuild the whole thing. So with that in mind, and Abbas and I wrote a piece together to say, look, this is really the time that if somehow, one could get the Iranian people to understand, if you want nuclear power, we understand that. And you signed the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you have the right to nuclear power. But it doesn't say anything that you have the right to enrich. And in fact, the enrichment part, if I look at the whole nuclear fuel cycle, for nuclear power, it's the part that's easiest to get from other places. And in fact, it's not only easy to get, you can buy it from the Russians, you can get it from the Chinese, you can get it from the Europeans. The supply has political diversity. So even if you don't get along with one country, you can buy it from someplace else. So that would be the way to go for the Iranians to finally say, yeah, we do want a nuclear power program. And they do have that one, Russian finished reactor of an early German build. They could have more nuclear reactors. They just don't do nuclear enrichment. And then my good colleague, Ernie Moniz, former Secretary of Energy, wrote a piece just a few weeks ago to actually say, look, we could look beyond that and to look at regional fuel cycle facilities, regional enrichment capabilities. And it turns out that's an idea that's been around for at least 20 years and actually well developed at various times, starting in the 2000s or so. And there are even a few demonstrations of that. The NTI organization in Washington had helped to broker sort of regional fuel bank in Kazakhstan. The Russian actually had an international uranium enrichment, capability. So that's the way that one could go. So if we get the Iranians to actually understand, and maybe now with where they are, that perhaps this is the time. And then my last comment is, so what did President Trump accomplish by going in, doing the bombing? Well, in terms of the bombing, he made it a little more difficult. But to me, that wasn't the important thing. The important thing actually is what he did. He showed resolve. And you might not like, us going over and bombing somebody else's facility. But boy, if they ever wanted to get the message across, that, that Americans are not going to stand for the fact that if you're going to get close to a bomb. And so that may also then sort of tip where we go in the future. So with that, I'm going to turn the solution of all this over to my colleagues.
Yes, absolutely. I have all the solutions. As I was thinking about how to connect the beginning to now, I thought of a poem by T.S. Eliot, a line of poem by T.S. Eliot. It says, "In my beginning is my end." The beginning of Iran's nuclear program was created by the United States and helped fundamentally by Israel. I'll describe that a little bit. And the virtual dismantling of much of it was also done by the United States and Israel. There is some continuity between Iran's program under the Shah with the current regime and some profound discontinuities. And I'm going to try in 15 minutes to describe this. Professor Hecker referred to a recent article we wrote about how now that you don't have an infrastructure for enrichment, accept the reality and take on a more pragmatic point of view. But 11 years ago, we wrote another piece together under his technical and wisdom of all kind, and my knowledge of Iran a little bit. Both of these have appeared in Bulletin of Nuclear Atomic Scientists, where we trace some of the history of Iran's nuclear program and this question of enrichment. And we basically said that the Shah also made a mistake. The Shah made a mistake that did not listen to the US advice at that time. This is in late 60s, early 70s. There is a myth that the Islamic Republic of Iran and some of the progressive forces around the world have created, that the United States gave the Shah everything he wanted, and now that there is an anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist regime in Iran, they're denying it its rights. That's absolutely not true. The United States was at odds with the Shah from 1971 virtually to 1977 when Iran's nuclear program began. As soon as the US realized from varieties of sources that Iran was going towards a dual-purpose nuclear program, that it was putting pieces in place for a bomb, Soon as the Shah openly said, if anyone in this region develops a bomb, we want to be right there and develop the bomb tomorrow. He told this to Akbar Etemad, the head of Iran's nuclear program. I interviewed him for a book, and he told me this. He said, I told the Shah, I'm the head of the nuclear program. You're doing things that don't make sense to me. The Shah sat me down and said, let me tell you what we're doing. We want every piece to be in place. If anybody in the neighborhood, I'm not talking, he said, about Soviet Union. Iran at the time was worried about Iraq. Iran was on record in 1968 about the development of weapons of mass destruction. So the US offered the Shah a deal. They said, forgo enrichment, do what South Korea did, and we'll help you develop nuclear technology. South Korea is now an exporter of nuclear technology. Iran hasn't produced an iota of electricity, has spent, by some accounts, in terms of direct investment and lost economic opportunities, close to $1 trillion on a program that has now very, very little to show for it. It all began with Atoms for Peace. I virtually remember it as a child. When I was going to school, suddenly there were posters all around streets in Tehran. It was a very beautiful, colorful poster. United States on one side, Iran on the other. Eisenhower stretching hands with the Shah. It was a very glorious village there with electricity. It says Atoms for Peace. The US provided the first elements of an experimental program, essentially for medicine, for Tehran University, that nothing was done with. And then by late 60s, the Shah had a lot of money. The Shah was looking for what Scott Sagan in his seminal essay talks about nuclear program as a sign of power, as a sign of modernity, as a sign of prestige. The Shah now wanted a nuclear program. And he began developing it with very little long-term planning. Literally gave Akbar Etemad 2 weeks to develop a nuclear program for Iran. And in 2 weeks, Akbar Etemad developed a plan, took it to the Shah. The Shah read it and said, yes, budget this. The biggest investment Iran had made under the Shah, other than oil program, was decided in this way. By one person, essentially, Akbar Etemad, who just died about a year and a half ago. But then they began to go towards enrichment. And there's a whole file. If any of you are interested in the history of this, you should go on file online, National Security file, National Security Agency file is called Iran's Nuclear Dossier. It has thousands of pages, secret negotiations between the Shah and the US, where the US is pressuring the Shah to give up enrichment, and the Shah says no. Under NPT, it is our God-given right. It doesn't say God-given right. It said it is our right. I won't be treated as a second-class citizen. If anybody else has the right, we do it. And then as the US begins to sense that Iran is developing a nuclear program, the Shah found an ally, surprising ally in his program. That surprising ally was Israel. Israel became the most important supporter of Iran's development of a nuclear weaponized program. And the logic is very clear. Iran at the time, I'm talking about mid-70s, was the most reliable ally of Israel in the Middle East. They worked together on intelligent issues. They worked themselves on military issues. They worked together on anti-Egypt issues. Mossad had literally a center, an office for propaganda against Nasser in Iran. They worked very closely together. And the Shah convinced. We have some of the minutes of discussions. The Shah actually asks, I interviewed the Israeli ambassador to Iran. The Shah asked the Israeli ambassador in Tehran to use his influence to get the Americans to back off the limits they had put on Iran. Iran then, the Shah then, Ardashir Zahedi then, much of these documents are now in our archive, use anybody and everybody from Kissinger to Rockefeller to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to pressure first the Nixon, then the Carter administration to allow the Shah to continue his program. And by the time they achieved that agreement, the revolution was 2 years away. And once the revolution happened, one of the first things that Mr. Khomeini did, I think it's maybe second or third, the first thing he did is change laws that had given equal rights, virtual equal rights to women. That was his first priority. He banned all of those rights. Then he said, this nuclear program is junk. Iran doesn't need a nuclear program. And he stopped it. And the nuclear facility in Bushehr, 75% finished, was stopped. They told them, this is 75% finished. So turn it into a wheat silo. And Iran stopped. And restarted it secretly 4 years later, after the war with Iraq, after Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranians, after the West, the United States included, did nothing to protest the use of chemical weapons against innocent Iranians. And the regime decided that they need to have a bomb of their own. And then they began the secret search using Pakistan, using technologies that they had, using eventually North Korea, China, and Russia to get to where they are. They have consistently, this is a history, but I want to talk for the next 5 minutes on what the discourse in Iran has become after the war. The rhetoric from Iran was almost up to 2 years ago, with a kind of a Leninist discipline from every faction of the regime. The rhetoric coming out of Iran was that there is a fatwa against developing of the bomb, and we don't want the bomb. We have no weapons program. We don't have any military program. For the last year, particularly for the last 2 or 3 months, that language has not changed. They openly began to talk about the bomb about 2 years ago, about the capability to have the bomb. About 2 years ago, they began to say that, look, we have everything in peace. If you push us, we'll do it. We are one turn away, the key turn away. Salehi, who was a student of your friends, that Professor Nunes, he had one time led the nuclear program. He said, I can tell you absolutely, as an expert, as a minister, as a person in charge, we can make the bomb tomorrow if we want to. Just last week, Mr. Shamkhani, who is one of the closest advisors to Khamenei, who was a minister of defense, who is in charge, who was till a few weeks ago in charge of the Council of Advisors to Khamenei, he said, I made a mistake. We should have gone for the bomb several years ago. And more, they openly talk about how if we had the bomb, Israel would have never dared attack us. So the rhetoric has changed, and now they're much more openly talking about what makes for a complicated scene is that Iran is undergoing, I think, the most profound domestic challenge to the regime it has ever faced. At least, if not to the regime, but certainly the most serious challenge to Khamenei's leadership. There is now more open talk criticizing Khamenei and every facet of his leadership. Many people from within the regime. Mr. Karoubi, who has spent several years in prison, just gave sort of a talk directly attacking Khamenei, saying that his misbegotten policies have gotten the country into this moment of crisis. So it's a moment that the regime is in an inner fight, precisely like mafia dons going at one another in a gang war. I've never seen the Iranian regime fighting within itself as it is. And at this moment, trying to develop a nuclear program, a new nuclear program, is, if not dangerous, extremely, extremely perilous. Thank you.
So this is a headline from the Jerusalem Post. It says, "We may need to act again," a quote by a senior IDF official warning of a possible renewed Iranian threat. So the question is, for me, when we think about what's next for Israel, Iran, and should we think about another possible strike, or maybe a spate of strikes, or maybe the Iranians kicking it off this time in Israel, responding, I think a good place to start is how exactly did we get here? I'll try not to repeat everything that was said, but I will try to give some context that I think is relevant. So Rising Lion and Midnight Hammer, the two basically joint operations we saw in June, the Israeli and the American operation, they have a very interesting context, and it's a shared context. So the Israeli strike, Rising Lion, it has some historical precedents. I know some of you in the room are well aware of some of these precedents. There was the strike against the Iraqi reactor, in Baghdad in 1981, and in Syria, there was the strike against the Syrian reactor in 2007. However, in some respects, it was quite unprecedented. It was the first time that such an Israeli operation took part as a part of a broader war, and we know this today is the 12-day war with broader, much broader war aims. We're not talking about a single strike like we saw in Syria and in Iraq. The Israelis also targeted Iranian missile sites, air defenses, leading figures in the scientific and military establishment. It capitalized on the strike that Zig mentioned earlier, the operation which took place on 26 October 2024. The Israelis called it Days of Repentance, but they actually called 3 different operations over time Days of Repentance, but you know, whatever. These strikes targeted Iranian military sites, including the air defense batteries, which we mentioned were so important, and some missile production facilities, but significantly, the Iranians were actually warned in advance because this was a retaliation strike for the Iranian strike, missile strike earlier that October. And no nuclear facilities, as Zig mentioned, were targeted, but it was remarkable or unprecedented in the sense that over 100 aircraft, including F-35s, participated in it. So we're not talking about this narrow operation where a handful of jets fly in and they bomb. In terms of what we just mentioned of targeting key personnel in the nuclear and the military established, there was some precedent. There are many precedents if we think about the covert operations against the Iraqi nuclear program, but specifically also in August 2008, Brigadier General Mohammed Suleiman, the Syrian official overseeing the country's covert nuclear program and a close advisor to the now deposed President Bashar Assad, was assassinated near Tartus, reportedly by Israeli commanders in a secret operation. So we do see some precedents to what we just talked about. In terms of the US strike, Operation Midnight Hammer was unprecedented, but not unexpected. It was actually very much expected and very much in the cards. So historically, when we think about how the US kind of dealt with these questions, we definitely can see that the US has refrained from launching overt bolt out of the blue counter-proliferation strikes like it did with Midnight Hammer, but there are precedents here as well. So historically, when the US targeted hostile nuclear facilities before June 25, it did so either as a part of a broader military campaign, think about Iraq in 91, Iraq in 2003, or covertly like in Operation Olympic Games, where it deployed different versions of the malware that the media told us should be dubbed Stuxnet, but internally the operation was labeled Olympic Games. And this happened during 2 administrations, Bush and Obama. So it's not a single administration initiative. And Midnight Hammer was not unexpected because it was very much a natural continuation of a previous culminating policy. It was a culmination of a process that began in the early 90s, where increased hostile nuclear proliferation, revelation about Iraq's nuclear program after 91. Let me remind you that after the first Gulf War ended. So I told Abbas to cough if I speak too loudly, and now I heard the cough, but it was Zig. So you know what? I'm going to just...
I was about to cough.
You were about to cough. Okay. So let me just remind you that in 91, after the first Gulf War, when the international community went in, they found that Saddam Hussein actually had quite a developed covert nuclear program. So this really focused the attention on what would later become known as rogue states developing covert nuclear programs. And there's also concern of leakage of talent and knowledge from the now disbanding Soviet nuclear program. And this led the US to prioritize countering nuclear proliferation, especially for these so-called rogue states. And counter-proliferation became a center pillar of strategy in the US in the 90s. And it also changed how the US viewed Israel's approach to the issue, because in the 1970s and 1980s, the US largely rejected what it saw as Israeli alarmism over nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. But in the early 90s going forward, you see a gradual adaptation of this approach and the understanding that nuclear proliferation in the Middle East is something that the US should deeply think about and care about. So for example, in the 90s, the archival documents are not yet open to us, but we know that collaboration, diplomatic and intelligence collaboration between Israel and the US over the Iranian nuclear program began. And we also see indications of some sort of a diplomatic collaboration to block civilian nuclear exports to Syria, specifically from Argentina. So we know that this issue was gradually becoming more prominent. And 9/11 and the war on terror really brought Israel-US collaboration to the next level, but it took time. So if you can recall the 2003 war in Iraq and Libya's the deal that the Brits and the Americans reached with the Libyans in 2003, Israel was actually not involved in these two operations or developments. But in 2007, when Israel attacks in Syria, the Bush administration already unfurls what we can call a diplomatic umbrella over it. And as I mentioned, under Bush and Obama, the two nations also carried out reportedly, so they've never officially admitted it, but according to reports, they carried out Operation Olympic Games or Stuxnet, so covertly damaging Iranian facilities, enrichment facilities, specifically in Natanz. What I'd like to focus on now is the revision of how the Iranian threat was perceived following the October 7th war and consequent development, and Zig touched on it. I'll try to expand a little bit. So up until October 24, Israel's operational plans to strike Iran, according to what we know in the press, were relatively limited compared to what we saw in June, and this is according to interviews and statements by Israeli officials. And the plans included what we would term in the military standoff as in the military jargon is standoff capabilities. So this is basically when you're wary of the air defense systems of the other side, and you're not going to try to just fly over and bomb it. You're going to try to maybe use your stealth bombers, or maybe just attack from afar, from a safe distance, using a standoff capability. But the October 7th war really changed the calculation. First, documents captured by Israel in Gaza during the war, and you see one example here on the left, proved that Iran was actually an active partner in funding and planning the operation, internally labeled by Hamas the Big Project. The stated aim of the operation was to dismantle the state of Israel by a coordinated multi-front assault, and those of you who speak Arabic will be able to actually read it here. Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, did not share the exact date, due to probably secrecy concerns, and this is something we, in the scholarly community will try to look into what exactly the Iranians knew and what were they not privy to in terms of how the operation ended up being launched. But Iran and Hezbollah participated in the war. There's this misconception that Iran and Hezbollah didn't actively participate in the war on following October 7th. They did participate. It wasn't participating immediately by launching missiles. The first Iranian missile barrage took place in April 24, but participation did take place. Hezbollah joined the day after. Iran encouraged the Houthis to join in. So it was a multi-pronged, multi-tier, multi-front war from the beginning. And also the second thing, and you see here the photo of this in October 24, in April and in October 24, when the Iranians launched two operations they dubbed True Promise 1 and 2. They launched salvos of missiles and drones, which basically didn't reach Israel at Israel. And this was a very clear demonstration that Israel was basically very much lacking in its deterrent capabilities. The construct was that Israel wasn't able to deter Iran from taking this very drastic move, which didn't happen before 2024, right? So we have barrages of, in October 24, this was between 180 to 200 ballistic missiles. So this is a very serious, a very dramatic move. These developments combined led the Israelis to perceive the Iranian nuclear and ballistic missile program combined as a much more dangerous threat than previously was seen and perceived. So it changed, it caused a whole revamp, a whole revision of how the Iranian threat was perceived. Iran's existing nuclear program, not its expected nuclear program, the program as it stood then was consequently reframed in November 24 as an existential threat. The Israelis began developing a much broader operational plan based on a stand-in capability. So now they wanted to figure out how to bring hundreds of F-15 and F-16 jets to the ability where they can actually operate freely above Tehran skies and in Iranian skies. And eventually the first strike actually included more than 200 aircraft, which is a very, very major air operation. This was done basically to offset Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. And Zig also mentioned a Mossad operation and a covert ground operation, which took place on the first night of the war, which also played a part in disabling some of these systems. In December, reportedly, another component was introduced to the plan, the elimination of the leading Iranian nuclear scientists. And we talked about this previously. This was done basically to prevent Iran from being able to quickly reconstitute the program, but probably for other deterrence purposes as well. The aim of the plan, and I'll talk about it in the next slide, wasn't to eliminate Iran's nuclear program completely. So we'll have a look at what they managed to do and what they didn't manage to do. But the major aim of the first night was to make sure that Iran wouldn't be able to launch 1,000 missiles in an initial response, and that was successfully achieved. So after the Israeli when the Israeli operation started, the first 5 waves of the attack included more than 330 munitions, which were launched by the roughly 200 aircraft I mentioned, and they targeted about 100 different targets. So this is a very, very wide operation. Iran's initial response was delayed, which was a major Israeli goal, to delay as much as possible the Iranian retaliation. And they managed to launch around 150 ballistic missiles in that first retaliation, which is considerably less than what the Israelis suspected they would be able to launch without interference. So just really to touch shortly, I guess I have about 5 more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about Fordo and the intelligence. So Israeli operational aims, according to statements by Israeli officials, were to degrade Iran's nuclear program by targeting the 3 major nuclear facilities, Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordo. And I'll talk about Fordo in a minute. In addition to targeting the scientists and the leaders in the military establishment and other targets, the war aims did not include regime change, although this was certainly seen as an added bonus, and Israel was closely following developments in the domestic arena, hoping that things would happen, but they didn't. It wasn't a war aim that they were trying to seek. The idea was that this would create domestic shock that may contribute in the medium term or in the long term, perhaps, to the destabilization of the regime. The aims did not include, according to how we understand it today, the destruction of the about 408 kilos of highly enriched uranium. The understanding was that they would somehow be buried under the rubble. And this is something we don't have firm evidence on. We assume that it's likely that the Israeli intelligence probably knows where some of this is. This is just an assumption. It's a guesstimation. Israeli officials haven't made official statements on this. This is basically, it seems logical. Let's say it like that, but there's no firm understanding of that. So since Fordo, as Zig mentioned, is buried almost 100 meters underground, only certain specific American ammos, the GBU-57B MOP bombs, can effectively target it. I know it's a mouthful, so let's just call it those specific bunker busting bombs. These bombs can only be dropped from B-2 stealth bombers. Therefore, the Israelis needed the US to come in and complete the job, and the Israelis knew this. This wasn't something that they didn't take into account. It was later published around early August that there was a contingency plan for a ground-based commander raid to target Fordo, but it was not seen as practical, and no one was really keen on conducting it. And there was some sort of a psychological signaling here also. In January 2025, the Israelis published the details of an operation that took place 4 months previously in Syria in September 24. This operation was called Operation Many Ways, Mivtza Rabot HaDrachim. It's basically had a commando force storming a huge underground facility in Syria, where they basically took over the facility, destroyed it, and were successfully evacuated from it. And it's likely that the Israelis actually published it in footage just to signal that this was an ability, but on the ground we know that they didn't actually want to use it. So the understanding was from the Israeli side that you had to get Trump on board. Trump initially opposed the strike according to what we know now, but eventually was convinced to give Israel a conditional green light to strike. According to what was published, Israeli intelligence indicated that Iran was making critical progress in weaponization without taking the actual decision to go nuclear. Specifically, according to what was stated in the press, the Iranians were working on trigger mechanism, neutron initiator, and the plastic explosives, or the components that would contribute to Iran's ability to basically detonate a bomb and do it quickly, as Zig mentioned. And the concern was, according to what was leaked, that this would place Iran around 15 days away from being able to explode a bomb. This is ages away from the months that we discussed previously, or that we foresaw previously. And 15 days means that even if you get the intelligence indication, you can't actually act on it. So you basically, you'll have Iran being in this immunity zone of its own. And together with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria and the developments in the region, and we didn't even mention Hezbollah, but mirrored the developments in the region, created a window of opportunity where the Israelis managed to convince Trump to give this conditional green light. And just to conclude, I want to share with you this last slide with a few final ideas on where we're heading. So before I outline where I think we're heading, I think it's important to understand that Trump's green light to the Israelis was conditional. He thought that they were basically selling a very high tail. He didn't think that the Israelis were likely to be able to deliver what they said they would be able to deliver in that first strike. He was very much concerned about US bases and whether US soldiers based in the region would be a target of Iranian retaliation. And assuming he would give a green light, whether the US bombers would actually be the target of Iranian air defenses. I think it's likely that we'll know in the coming months of years whether the Israelis actually told him we'll be able to make sure that these two things don't happen. It sounds logical to me that this is something that the Israelis said, we think we can deliver this. And I think that once they delivered it, this is probably a crucial element in Trump agreeing to deliver the final blow and basically giving his green light to the B-2 stealth bombers to bomb Fordo. Now we have to think about where we're heading. So Abbas and Zig mentioned earlier that currently Iran is basically in a situation where there's zero enrichment. Zero enrichment, if you want to block the Iranian nuclear program, is kind of great. So the question is, do we have a leadership in both countries, in Iran and in the US and elsewhere in the international community, that can deliver a deal which would see zero enrichment long-term, and what would happen in the meantime? Abbas also mentioned a lot of uncertainty around Khamenei, who will replace him. Maybe a moderate leader that's more interested in reconstituting the Iranian economy will be more open to such a deal, and a more radical leader, not necessarily so. We also have questions around the fuel bank, and you mentioned this. I thought it was very interesting. It was first floated in the 1970s in the Middle East, where you had Israelis talking about possibly setting up a fuel bank which would serve Israel and Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula. So these things have been going around for quite some time. A big question, and you see here in the photo, you see the Chinese portable launcher and HQ-9 system is, what will Iran do next in terms of reconstituting its nuclear program, its ballistic missile program, air defenses? What exactly is it planning to do? There are no confirms, but some reports that China is thinking about supplying some of the components needed to rebuild Iran's air defenses. The Chinese don't officially confirm this. It's also possible that instead of complete systems, they'll deliver chunks of it. And it's highly likely that Iran will not flaunt this, and we won't have official confirmation of this anytime soon. What will be Israel's response? The Israelis outwardly stated that they would act if they see Iran trying to reconstitute the ballistic missile program. But I think it's one thing to declare it, and it's one thing to operate in Iran the same way Israel is currently operating in Lebanon, where it's repeatedly targeting Hezbollah targets south of the Litani River, and this is kind of accepted. I don't think that the same thing will be true if Israel repeatedly strikes non-nuclear facilities in Iran. I think the international community will view strikes against the nuclear facility differently. I think I probably talked more than 15 minutes, so I will leave it here, and over to you, Scott.
Thank you. I thank all three speakers. You packed a lot in. I'm going to ask one question, and I'm going to start looking into the audience and getting people. And if you can ask a question, not just make a statement, that would be appreciated. And if you could identify who you are and your affiliation, if that's all right. So I'm just going to start by saying this panel was called "What's Next in the Iran-Israel Nuclear Conflict?" The great philosopher Yogi Berra once said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I want each of you to say, and I will give mine first, if there is this panel reconstituted in October next year, what will the title of the panel be? My prediction is that it will be called "Mowing the Lawn: Why Israel Attacked a Second Time." Sig, what's the title of this panel going to be?
I think that's quite possible, and I would actually.
That's not a good name. That's not a good title for a panel.
Israel attacks, and Trump joins in again.
Yeah. Abbas.
I don't think Israel will attack because I think Israel and the United States are watching what I am watching, which is a regime on the verge of collapse. I don't think they need to expedite the process. My sense is that they have done the kind of damage that they want to do. The economy is almost unsalvageable under the current leadership. My guess is that title would be, "What is the new Iran going to do?"
What is the new Iran going to do? Ori.
Iran, so the meaning of the new Iran deal. That would be the title of the
Meaning of new Iran.
New Iran
I hope we
deal.
capture that, and then we'll vote in October next year for what it's going to be. I'm going to ask this gentleman in the front if you could get the microphone. Do we have a microphone going around?
I can speak well.
Well, we have people. We have 50 people on Zoom, so watching. So
Okay.
identify yourself and ask a question, please.
Oh, do I need to start up or no?
No.
Okay, so I have a basic question. If who is the moral authority here? And for example, Israel doesn't have nuclear bombs, and Iran shouldn't have it, and North Korea should have it. South Korea shouldn't have it. I mean, who is the moral authority here? I mean, I didn't hear anybody talking about that.
Can you
Good.
identify yourself, though? So
Okay.
say a bit more about who you are.
Oh, my name is Joseph Rashti. I'm a lecturer in accounting. And also
Thank you.
That question was directed to me, right? Or
yeah, I mean,
Well,
maybe
okay,
you
let-
were
let-
actually, because you
Alright.
started that, yeah.
so actually, I mean, you reflect what my wife often says. When I come home and I discuss this, she says, "Well, so we have nuclear weapons. Why shouldn't they?" Right. So that's more or less what you're reflecting. So the reason for that is we have an international system that's brought us to a place where we, for better or worse, it's on the nuclear trigger. And so we should try to limit that. So it's not that one person or one country has the authority. It's meant to be sort of international consensus as to what you do. So Eisenhower's view, back in 1953, that if you're going to get people to give up themselves developing nuclear weapons, you got to give them some hope. You got to give them the good side. Most countries in the world have signed up to this. They would get the benefit of keeping nuclear, would give up, going for the bomb. Iran signed something. They said, we're not going to develop nuclear weapons, and we're going to get the benefit. It's not that we tell them, somebody else tell them. They actually signed this. Now, there are a number of other countries, turns out, including Israel, India, Pakistan, that have not signed it. North Korea actually signed it once, but then for a variety of reasons, actually stepped back and pulled out of the treaty. So that's the only way that we know how to look at that. You gotta, the international community has to agree it's not good for everyone to have the trigger and have the bomb. And so you have to figure out a way to do this. And that's not a perfect system by any means, but boy, it's a lot better than what could have developed, in my opinion.
Let me follow up. Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty says that all members of this treaty, or nothing in this treaty stops a country from having its inalienable right to civilian nuclear energy in conformity with Articles 1 and 2. So as often happens in international law, a treaty is signed with something that's a bit contradictory, that it's inalienable. It's the strategist Albert Wohlstetter says it's as if all countries have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of plutonium. But it says it's in conformity with Article 2, which says you're not trying to get nuclear weapons. So once you're caught by the IAEA trying to get nuclear weapons, you no longer have that right. You might get it back again if the IAEA says, yeah, there's no evidence that they're getting this. But I think that's part of the moral authority issue, is that you signed an agreement, you got nuclear power under part because of that agreement, you were caught violating the agreement, you no longer have the right to the power.
Scott, if I may just cut in, because Abbas and I have had many discussions, along this way of the inalienable right, is what the treaty says is to nuclear energy
right.
and a peaceful mode. It doesn't say nuclear enrichment. And yet the Iranian regime, and like many others, has really used that to say, the inalienable. They've played it up, right, within the country to tell its people they're taking away our inalienable right. It's not enrichment. They have a reactor that's making electricity. The Russians are supplying the slightly enriched uranium fuel for that. So somehow, that was basically my bottom line, is could we somehow get the people over that? But that's going to be very hard when they've played this card.
Evan.
Kevin Bustamante, I'm a CSEC postdoc. So maybe I'm misreading the panel a little bit. Thank you all. But right now it sort of seems like there's a hope for the possibility that the strikes on Iran will probably create opportunities for cooperation going forward. And I guess I'm curious, what are the historical precedents for this, of attacks leading to cooperation? I'm just curious to see how the panel is thinking about this. Thank you.
Well, I can't tell you about historical. I mean, there are historical examples where countries have suffered the military, for example, defeat. Which to me, this was for Iran, although Iran declares that it has won the war, where they decide to negotiate. and become more law-abiding. But I think, to me, what has some hope for optimism is that the damage is so fundamental to the enrichment program and to much of the nuclear infrastructure, and the damage to the economy, and the pressures that are in the economy, and the unwillingness of the regime's only viable allies to help the China and Russia. They didn't help them during the 12-day war. They haven't really come to the table to help them now. I would be very surprised that they give them anything of substance in order to allow them to rearm for themselves. So those in Iran who have a great stake in keeping this game for themselves within the regime, for example, have recognized that unless they make a deal, the whole game is gone for them. There are people with profound stakes in the regime who are now actively saying, we got to go and negotiate. We got to resume negotiations with the United States. People who are openly, the president of Iran, Rouhani and Zarif, have been on a charge against China and Russia in Iran over the last month and a half. So much so that the Speaker of the House, in a remarkable gesture, came and essentially attacked the ex-president and the ex-foreign minister for criticizing China and Russia and saying they haven't helped us and they betrayed us.
Ori,
Go ahead.
So I think Kevin's question is great, and we need to consider two possible models, not of outcomes, not necessarily leading to peace agreements between Israel and these actors, but to other modalities. So in Iraq in 81, what happened, we now know happened, is that Iraq, quote unquote, went underground, and this went undetected. But after 91, when the US bombed its nuclear facilities as a part of the broader campaign, it didn't reconstitute. After 2003, it didn't reconstitute. In 2007, Syria didn't reconstitute. So strikes don't necessarily lead to a plan being reconstituted or not reconstituted. It's a part of a broader equation that's interesting. And specifically in the Syrian context, we saw years later the regime collapse. And the question is, will destabilization, will an energy that's basically destabilizing the regime, like Abbas said, will it conflate with the fact, sorry, I can't see, will it conflate with the immediate consequences of the attack like we outlined? And here's something very, very important. So a lot of Israeli officials, Mossad officials or security establishment officials in the past couple of years have been giving extensive interviews explaining Israel's historic policies and approach to Iran's nuclear program. And Tamir Pardo, the former head of Mossad, said the following very interesting thing. He was in charge of developing the approach to Iran's nuclear program in the early 2000s, when Meir Dagan became the head of the Mossad, and Ariel Sharon, the prime minister, tasked him with coming up with an Iran nuclear policy. And he said that the Israelis, given their very bad experience in Lebanon in the 80s, where they tried to back a Christian-led government and it fell to pieces, they completely they never thought about pushing a regime change from the outside. They're always very happy to support anything that happens domestically, but it's not something that they think about doing externally. What they did want to do was exhaust the motivation. So if you create a lot of damage over 20 years, which is basically what they did, and then you bomb it, and then the price tag for reconstituting is so high and the economy is doing so poorly, you get an equation where you could, under the right leader, tilt, I guess, the balance toward the abandonment or further investment in that. Hope it answers.
follow on.
Scott, I'd also like to just weigh in
Please.
briefly, because it's a very, very good question. And I think a lot about that. And I generally am not in favor of going in and using force, to try to move to its solution. Although there are times when it's worked out incredibly well. The one that in 2007, I followed that very, very closely as to what happened there with the bombing of the Syrian reactor. And what was so incredible about that, the Israelis went and took it out. There's actually, I don't know whether there's a great book on that by Yaakov Katz called Shadow Strike. He explains it all as to how the Israelis tracked that down. But anyway, in that case, the Israelis wiped it out. And then the Syrians cleaned it up. They basically said, oh, that was never really there, because they didn't want to have been known as having had that facility. But that's a very special case. In the case of Iran, what brought me to the conclusion that I had mentioned was initially I did not favor the US going in and doing the bombing. Once it was done, what I'm hoping for, that it changes Iran's risk calculus, in terms of how much is it going to cost them to go ahead and try to reconstitute versus what could they get by dropping it. And what I said before is what Trump showed in this is resolve. So if he went in once, the Iranians have to be there and say, we're going to try to rebuild this, but this guy's going to come and he's going to bomb it again. And that to me would change the risk calculus to the point to say, maybe this is the time to actually say, let's forget the enrichment. So that drove me to that conclusion. Thank you.
There's someone here, the woman with the glasses halfway back, yes. Identify yourself, please.
Hi, Mariam Fatuhi. I work at Hoover Institution Library and Archive, Iran Project. And my question is for Dr. Milani. After several attacks on Iran, he had a beautiful piece about basically commentary on that Iran is best to shift the focus from nuclear to innovation. And I wanted to know, like, the sort of empowerment for innovation would be a boosted economy, a sort of a healthy economy. And I was thinking, what if we shift is it possible, and perhaps this question would be for the next year panel, but would it be that we shift the focus from the nuclear to the Iran uranium, which is one of the highest quality uranium, and create a similar deal and dialogue that happened between Ukraine, US, and Russia, that basically created, by sharing this, very valuable sort of resources, both created strategic alignment with the West, as well as boost, obviously for Iran, can boost the economy and perhaps, fasten the process of shifting the regime and all that. Because I also feel like with the China being, as you mentioned in your presentation, being an ally with current Iran, perhaps China wouldn't hesitate to access to these sort of natural resources as a raw material and not even nuclear.
Well, first of all, let's begin at the end. I don't believe China is a very committed ally of Iran. China is a very opportunistic ally of Iran, as is Russia. They both see a desperate regime. They both see Mr. Khamenei, who is desperate in trying to align himself with the East. It's been his policy for 25 years. And they have basically taken whatever they can from these deals and gone their own way. They have signed strategic deals with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Israel. Russia has done exactly the same thing. But they paid diplomatic courtesies to Iran and occasionally throw some crumbs. So that's why I think what is happening in Iran is a surge of recognition that the status quo and the strategies of the past 30 years are not working. And that there are many people within Iran are trying to see whether they can repivot the ship to a path where economic progress, rather than arming proxies in the region, building Iran, rather than the destruction of Israel, for example, alliance with everybody, Russia, China, everybody, independent Iran should have relations with all of these countries. Now it has relationship with almost nothing, unless it pays. Its allies are all bought allies. And I think that surge might optimistic, hopeful, force the structure of power in Iran to recognize that the status quo is no longer tenable. And unless they go for development, unless they go for the inclusion of women, unless they stop the rhetoric of dangerous rhetoric of destruction of Israel, destruction of the United States, all of these, then there might be a new attack. There might be more confrontation.
Thank you, panel. Austin Gruber, I'm a National Defense Fellow here at CSAC. My question's for you, Professor Hecker. The fascinating idea of the inalienable right to nuclear energy as opposed to refinement. And we talked a little bit about NPT, and there's compellence to comply because by giving up the weapon, you gain the energy piece. And so from an application standpoint of regional enrichment and those types of things, is it aspirational, or is there some way to compel the broader community to pursue that type of a means of control? Thank you.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, and quite frankly, my answer is I don't understand the region well enough to be able to answer your question, and so I was very glad to have two regional experts. You know, if you'd asked me that question about the Far East or even Europe, you know, I could do a little bit better because I've spent much more time there. So I think for the most part, it's aspirational. People who really understand the region say, you know, you're just never going to be able to get the Iranians to work with the Saudis, work these other. My hope, the aspiration is aimed towards the fact that, first of all, I think Iran right now is in a bad place. And then, you know, as Abbas says, maybe things will happen politically. I don't know. Certainly in all of my dealing with representatives of this regime in the nuclear arena, it's the most deceptive and deceiving of any of the countries I work with, and you include North Korea and a few places. I mean, this is really difficult. So since Iran is in a somewhat bad place, you know, that offers one possibility. The fact that Trump has demonstrated that, look, I'm willing to take action, that also adds to that. And then we really have a really serious issue about Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia wanting enrichment. And the Trump administration sort of seems to be wavering on that as to what it's going to do. And then we have this great example of the United Arab Emirates, right? So when they first signed up, you know, they want nuclear reactors, my own reaction was, you know, being a nuclear guy, it's a dumb idea. They've got all this oil and gas, you know. And of course, and I went to UAE and I talked to them, you know, saw how they were preparing. And actually, when I saw that, it was all being done very, very smartly. And when I said that to them, they essentially said, look, you know, we want to get nuclear electricity to power, and we can sell the oil and gas. It will pay for the reactors plus more. And the good example is, you know, they were willing to adopt, you know, what's called the gold standard, which you know well, and that's no enrichment, no back-end reprocessing. Then they were smart enough actually not to try to get an American contractor to build those reactors because, quite frankly, we don't know how to do it anymore. So they got the South Koreans, you know, which at that time were the best reactor builders. I think the Chinese are getting pretty close. And they've done it. They've got 4, you know, big light water reactors actually operating. They have no enrichment. They have no reprocessing. They have done nuclear energy the way we all sort of said, this is the ideal. So you have an example. You have the Saudis who want to go in a different way, and then you have the Iranians in a bad way. And so that was my aspiration and my wishful thinking. Thank you.
I'm going to take some
We have a
questions.
student here. Is it okay if we let him ask a question?
Well, you are in charge, so yes.
He's also Abbas's student, so it's half and half.
I consider myself your student too, so go ahead.
I was actually also Professor Sagan's student, so
Hi, Sam.
3 for 4. But I guess, by the way, I'm Sam. I'm an undergrad here at Stanford. My question is, I think the domestic state in both Iran and Israel is going to be extremely determinative for what happens next. And it seems like in both cases, we always seem to be on the edge of change. In Iran's case, it seems like it's on the verge of regime change the last 20 years. And and Israel's been able to put up with massive political discontent. Netanyahu seems to have been weathering the storm. Why are we to believe that this time it's different? And if there is going to be change, is this just going to vindicate the hardliners and the war hawks, or is this going to create room for maybe the more pragmatic elements in both countries? Thank you.
You want to go first?
No.
I think that's a very good question. The regime change hasn't happened, but the regime has changed. Iran today is not the Iran of 20 years ago. In Iran of today, women can virtually walk in the streets as they desire. That's the result of a democratic movement that has forced the regime to change its policy. The Iranian but what they did in 1989, for example, killing 4,000 people within 3 months, that no longer is possible. Torture, the way they did it, is no longer possible. There's more freedom. The way Rouhani and Zarif and Karoubi and some of the papers take on Khamenei. Israel cannot, the United States cannot, they do not have the moral authority, they don't have the political capability of forcing the future of Iran. The future of Iran has to be determined by Iranian people, but they're trying, and they have in many ways succeeded. They are forcing this regime, and gradually, I think, we are getting to a point, that inflection point. If they don't take the next few steps, I think then we have a new ball game.
And in Israel, we're also approaching an inflection point, which will be very significant to the future pathways that Israel takes. Israel is in an election year. It's going to be very dramatic. It's currently experiencing backsliding, and I think that democratic backsliding. And I think that there's a consensus that the results of the coming elections will really determine the way that goes, and it will have a huge impact on the region, on relations with Iran, depending on the kind of new leadership that at some point we will see. How old is the current supreme leader? 86? I mean,
86.
87.
For
I mean,
20 years,
okay.
people have predicted he's about to die.
Yeah, I mean, no. But I'll give you a very interesting quote by a scholar called Trita Parsi, wrote a book about Israel-Iran relations, and he interviewed an Israeli diplomat who passed away called Dori Gold, who was a very close confidant of Netanyahu. And Dori Gold told Trita Parsi that in '96, when Netanyahu just won the elections after Israeli Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated this week 30 years ago, actually, Netanyahu wanted to see if there was any room for detente with the Iranian, because Khatami had just been elected, and Khatami was relatively moderate towards the US in his statements. So they sent out feelers, and the feelers were basically rebuffed. But this anecdote goes to show that there isn't an internal systemic reason for these two countries to be at loggerheads with each other. This has to do with the Iranian regime and its utilization of Israel as a, let's say, a lightning rod for hostility, but it's something we need to watch for.
Just a very, very brief comment. So I don't have much faith in regime change, especially in other countries. You know, as I've watched, people have said for years, you know, Putin's got to go. He's still there, right? Since 2000, and then the Kims in North Korea that I know much better in terms of what's happened there, and it's been said so much, you know, we're going to get a regime change. Well, it's the lack of empathy in this country for those other countries not understanding. I think we should turn our attention to actually see whether we can have regime change in the United States this next time around.
I want to make sure that people on Zoom have a chance to ask a few questions. There are two here. One is that Dr. Hecker explained that he doesn't like the assassination of nuclear scientists, which is understandable given that he's a nuclear scientist. But could Dr. Milani say something about the degree to which other civilians were killed in these attacks in what's being reported in Iran? And could Dr. Rabinowitz say, how did Israel do this without killing so many civilians?
Well, first of all, Dr. Hacker and I actually wrote an article about 10 years ago together saying that there shouldn't be assassination of nuclear scientists. I'm not a nuclear scientist, but I also don't believe that that's a good idea, particularly because he is also a nuclear scientist. We don't want any harm to come to him. The official figure, the most recent official figure that the Iranian regime gave of what they call civilian casualty is 1,200 people that have been killed. But there are contentions that some of the people who are registered as civilian casualties might be Basijis, members of Basijis. There are sites on Iranian social media that have gone person by person and traced the names of these people and say, this person was a member of a militia and is being counted as. So the number of civilians, I think, is in that ballpark.
That ballpark.
Yeah, you know.
But let's hear from Rory.
Yes.
So more than 30 Israelis died in the Iranian missile attacks that took place in retaliation during the 12-day war. I think that the Israelis really tried to target quality targets when they went after the scientists. So, for example, or the military leaders. So there's a famous photo of a building with a hole in its wall where only a certain general was taken out and the entire building remained intact. I don't think this was an operation that was planned to cause massive damage to the civilian population. But my question to you, and my question is to everyone, if we accept the assumption that Iran assisted in funding and planning October 7th, then how do we count Israelis that died in that, since October 7th, or generally in Gaza and in the ongoing war? Where do we draw the line?
You had a comment?
Scott, in addition, you know, as I said, I don't like the idea of killing nuclear scientists as they go around the world, because I've been in all of these places, you know, and that thought just doesn't really please me very much. But in addition, what we said in that article, this was like 2013 or so, that the reasons for not doing this is, first of all, we said it doesn't work. And back in that day, we were talking about a handful or so of the key scientists. And it turns out you don't wipe out a nuclear program by killing, you know, half a dozen people. And so, first of all, it doesn't work. And in this particular case, I have to say, though, I mean, the penetration of the Israelis was so enormous, and the number of people killed in the scientific enterprise and then also in the military, you know, commanders' enterprise is so enormous. That probably also contributes to setting the program back some. Again, that doesn't condone it, but what we said before, that it doesn't work. In this case, I think it will work to some extent. But then the other reason I said back then, and this is just based on my own interaction, you know, I've been to every country that has a declared nuclear weapons program, and I've been to the facilities of all of those places. And so I've worked very, very closely with the nuclear enterprise and the people. And quite frankly, my conclusion from all of this is that as I've looked at them and worked with them, the nuclear people are part of the civil society of those countries. So they're actually the ones that we'd have a chance, you know, of trying to make sure that things go in the right direction. So, for example, in Iran, you know, the scientists, in my opinion, if the government actually turned back to the scientists, you know, I could see the scientists say, oh God, enrichment. First of all, it's not all that interesting scientifically or technically, you know, it's been done there. So why in the world? what I'd much rather do is so-and-so. So I think you don't want to kill off all the scientists and put that part of the civil society.
Can I just, go ahead.
It's also worth mentioning that the first nuclear scientist that was a target for a possible assassination was Werner Heisenberg when he was a part of the Nazi program, and the people planning it were the Americans. They didn't act it out.
What makes the Iranian case complicated, and what makes the number of people who were killed in the recent, is that with the exception of a few, the rest of the nuclear scientists were all generals of the IRGC. So they went after a few handful of people who were civilians, but according to the US and Israeli intelligence, they were working with the IRGC's nuclear program. But still, we just thought we should know that.
I just want to push on this issue a bit because there's this famous scene in Oppenheimer, the film, in which Oppenheimer shows up with an army uniform on. And he's told by Rabi, take off the uniform where we want to be civilians.
Rabi.
Rabi, yeah. And
Robert Bacher.
And so, the US military at one point wanted to have all Los Alamos scientists be part of the military because we were at war and they're making weapons of war. There have been others who have said, well, if you get a wartime deferment and you're a scientist, you're part of the war effort, and that is the standard. And the question here is not whether this is an assassination during peacetime. If Ori is right, Israel and Iran are at war. And if you look at the actions going on, so to me, that's a very different condition than a condition in which we're in a peaceful state, even if we have tense relations. So not only did we consider assassinating Heisenberg, we did bomb university sites in Germany that we thought, that the United States thought were part of the Nazi nuclear program. So there are historical precedents here that are worth considering. Yeah, the student on the left in the back there.
Hi, my name is Basil Oji. I'm a freshman here at Stanford. I wanted to put it bluntly, the Western caricature of the Iranian regime, that it's a mad mullah run regime and that it's a rogue state that is irrational. The question is that, do you believe that this is the case? Do you believe that Iran is an irrational state? And if it's not, why wouldn't the precedent of mutually assured destruction work if Iran got the nuke? Why wouldn't a nuclear Middle East, i.e. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran having nukes, create a safer and more stable Middle East? And thank you.
But maybe you should answer the first.
I'd encourage you to read The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, a debate in which this issue is discussed in great detail. And my own view is that in this case, the Iranian government has said that its adversary does not deserve to survive. So it's an existential threat. Secondly, it, as we just saw, may have been involved in planning the October 7th attack. And once Hezbollah was hit and once the Syrians were hit, they launched 500 missiles against the country. That is not a country that I want to see have nuclear weapons. So I think mutually assured destruction is a powerful deterrent, but it's a very imperfect one. And I'd like to have fewer states have it, and those states that have it, I'd want them to be democracies if possible and controlled by reasonable people. Both conditions have to be there. Anyone else?
I think, I don't know where you get this generalization that Western countries caricatured the Iranian regime as a rogue state. Very few Western countries actually did this. The majority of the Western countries went out of their way for 25 years to try to negotiate with this regime. The Americans did it. The Europeans did it. In my view, wrongly, under the assumption that if you make concessions to this regime, you can get it to be a law-abiding. They made the concessions and the regime didn't correct this way. There is no other regime on the face of the earth that has abducted and executed as many of its dissidents in Europe and the United States. You have not. You don't have any other state that has done what this regime has done to its people, what this regime is doing on a daily basis to Iranian women. So I'm not the advocate of a rogue state. I think this is a rational state, but its rationality is very different than the rationality of you and I. This is a rationality of a regime that it sees itself as in a messianic role to export the revolution to the world. If you read Farsi, I hope you do, read the writings of Mr. Khamenei. See how he sees the world. I just wrote a piece in Caravan in English, and I have another piece coming up soon in the next 3 weeks in the Liberties on Khamenei's thinking about the world. See how he thinks about the world. It's very systematic. It is very rational, but the rationality is the rationality of a millenarian who thinks they have a messianic role to deliver the world into the final eschaton, the eschaton of a global Islamic state. Read what these people say. Don't rely on third-hand reporting by regime apologists who say this regime has issued a fatwa against a nuclear weapon and they will never pursue it. That's the lie that regime apologists, that's the caricature of a scholarship. So this is not a regime this is one of the most dedicated regimes to survive. They want to survive. That's why they calculate everything. This is not a regime that only supports Shiites. It supports anybody, Sunnis, anybody who can promote their goals. So it is not a rogue state. It is a regime with a rationality that, in my view, doesn't serve the interest of Iran, doesn't want peace in the Middle East. It is the most systematic, as systematic in its opposition to the Palestinian right to a state as the Israel's right wing. They're two sides of the same phenomena. They do not accept, the Iranian regime has been the most fierce opponent of the two-state solution since the two-state solution has come. The Palestinian majority want the two-state solution. The Iranian regime says, no, I want the Islamic State. Read what Khamenei has said about this.
And in the 90s, they funded the spate of the bus bombing that derailed the Oslo Accords.
Well, with apologies to the many people in the audience and the people who wrote questions online, it is 5 and we should conclude. I just wanted to make sure that that last answer was not cut off because I thought that was very powerful.
No, I actually apologize to the rest of the panel. I spoke a little too long.
No, it was excellent.
No.
So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking you.